Ye who seek to disturb the eternal peace and sleep of the high priest, beware. Flesh of my flesh shall creep into thy body and eat of the flesh of thy spirit until such time as ye shall return into the pit of everlasting darkness whence ye lived before life.
All right, let's cut it open.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. Not to be confused with the blacklisted screenwriter Howard E. Koch, Howard W. Koch moved from New York to Hollywood in the mid-1930s. He started out at 20th Century Fox as a messenger, gradually working his way up to production assistant, to the camera department, and then finally to second assistant director. By 1947, Koch left Fox and went independent, his eyes set on starting his own production company. He ended up collaborating with fellow Fox alum Aubrey Schenck, and together the two established Bel-Air Productions in 1953, Schenck managing a sweetheart finance and distribution deal with United Artists. The vast majority of Bel-Air's output from 1954 through 1958 were westerns, all of them shot for no more than $100,000 and usually back-to-back in the same Death Valley locations. Of notable exception was The Black Sleep, previously covered on this podcast, one of 3 horror films produced by the company. Late Victorian Gothic was a decidedly more ambitious terrain for Bel-Air than desert vistas and ghost towns, and for that, it cost Koch and Schenck just over the equivalent of 2 of their back-to-back cowboy flicks. United Artists released the film in June of 1956 as part of a double feature package with the British pickup, The Creeping Unknown, a slightly edited version of Hammer's 1955 science fiction movie, The Quatermass Experiment, also covered on this podcast in the same episode. Hammer would, of course, release The Curse of Frankenstein a little under a year later. But before then, as film historian Tom Weaver notes, The Black Sleep represented a significant bridge between the Gothic horror of the 30s and 40s and the next cycle of more graphic, late 50s fare that began cropping up as the appetite for aliens and mutant creature features declined. On the one hand, it featured all of the trademarks of a classic Hollywood horror, including stark black and white photography, moody period setting, and a star-studded cast of industry veterans like Basil Rathbone, Lon Chaney Jr., Bela Lugosi, and David Carradine. On the other hand, both its morbid story and explicit content, including a shot of an exposed brain during surgery, were stronger stuff by contemporary standards, presaging Hammer's own more influential establishment of a new Gothic standard, more overtly sadistic and, of course, in full color. Bel-Air would dip its toes into horror once more with a double feature package to be released in February of 1957, Voodoo Island and Pharaoh's Curse. Not nearly as ambitious as The Black Sleep, the film's content nonetheless reflected on the trend of low-budget filmmakers to return to the well of Gothic horror standards. Both films were written by Richard L. Landau, most notable for having collaborated with director Val Guest to adapt Nigel Kneale's The Quatermass Experiment, and both scripts share basically the same narrative and thematic structure. A group of white characters travel into the heart of hostile lands and have their modern, rationalist outlook challenged by indigenous magic beyond their comprehension. Generically speaking, this type of story extends way back to before the formalization of horror as a coherent genre, when popular literature portraying the supernatural was rooted in contemporary Gothic and Romanticist trends. Prototypical horror fiction frequently leaned upon the most tried and true of mythological and folkloric narratives, the journey of heroes into dark, liminal spaces between the land of the living and the world of the spirits, in order to both inspire the anxieties of readers increasingly steeped in context of industrial modernity and scientific rationalism, as well as to prey upon latent superstitions and phobias. As such, horror fiction often conflated a general fear of the unknown with contemporary national, cultural, and racial constructs. In the context of colonial and imperial white supremacy, the horrific was inextricable from the Slav, the Oriental, the Black, and the Indian. These subjects were at once empirically inferior to Anglo-Saxon whites, but they were also a source of intense fascination and, indeed, even erotic excitement, speaking to the repression and desperate longing produced by modernity. The foreign other is both a natural inferior to the modern white, but also demonstrates incredible facility for a new mythologizing, representing a more physically liberated, even more spiritually meaningful past for modern whites. As a symbolic representation of the other, the monster could also act out the repressed desires of a centralized white reader. Repulsion intermingling with arousal, we are thus faced with a duality in horror fiction that is notable when its focus on adventure, exploration, colony, and empire is most overt. They at once reinformed the necessity in white modernity taming, civilizing, compartmentalizing, and making productive those lands and peoples still steeped in the heart of darkness. But they can also, invariably, betray a degree of ambivalent motivation, in which the moral nature of the supposedly civilized is often even more impenetrably black than the man-child savage, in which the manifold forces of civilization do not appear any less barbaric than an Indian massacre, and in which the mission to assert supremacy is self-contradictory, futile, or even patently undesirable, where the point is not to rescue the righteous future of empire, but to punish the arrogance of its agents.
We had made camp, posted sentinels around, and turned in. It seemed like hours later. Or maybe it was only minutes. Without sound, without warning, nothing. And then suddenly they were all around us, among us. We couldn't tell them from our own. They butchered us proper, they did. Everything you touched was wet with blood. They cut Johnny's tongue out, made him watch while they fed it to the animals. They'd have done the same for me, or worse, if I hadn't gotten myself buried beneath a dead body. You'd think this was the Dark Ages instead of 1902.
While placed as the second bill in Bel-Air's double feature, Pharaoh's Curse was actually filmed first. Principal photography was completed in roughly a week, with 3 days of exteriors in the old reliable Death Valley standing in for remotest Egypt, and another 3 or 4 days of interiors done at the American National Studios, eventually to be bought out by Frederick William Ziv. The production was directed by Lee Sholem, soon to become an icon of TV, his notorious speed and efficiency earning him the nickname Rollem Sholem. With a reputation like that, it's unsurprising that Pharaoh's Curse turns out to be another in a long slew of mostly pedestrian horror pictures that fail to either mask their thinly drawn characters and plot with a showman's flair, or to get the most out of its few interesting ideas. That being said, Landau's script is the heart of the film. From the very beginning, it displays an uncommon earnestness to inspire dread, but without automatically dipping into obvious wells of the supernatural and the undead. Once the opening credits are finished rolling, we open on a map of the Mediterranean with the city of Cairo featured prominently at its center, a flag of the United Kingdom unfurled in the wind superimposed over the image. The score gives what appears to be a brief patriotic swell, before a harsh brass sting ushers us into the first scene, in which a pair of traumatized British colonial soldiers describe to a superior their experience being ambushed by nationalist zealots in the dead of night, the din of a potential riot building just outside of the room in which they're speaking. It is critical to point out that nothing in this scene technically has anything to do with the plot of Pharaoh's Curse. The protagonist of the film is not going to be one of these officers or their superior, but rather Mark Dana as Captain Storm, who had no involvement in the described events, and whose own mission is only indirectly connected to them. Throughout the film, the presence of not only British colonial forces, but also other European and American explorers is never in explicit contention, nor do Egyptian nationalist militants ever figure as complications in the plot. Rather ingeniously, Landau extrapolates loosely from a historical setting, Egypt as a de facto protectorate of the British Empire in the early 20th century, in order to ostensibly, and on more than one level, exploit a very thin premise for the most dramatic potential. First and foremost is the problem of how to introduce all of the essential expository elements of your story, the setting, the protagonist, and what their goals are, without it being boring.
Sir?
Sit down, Storm. It's not explosive enough around here for them. Patrols being wiped out, native uprisings against the crown. Now the Home Office cables we're to go out after an archaeological expedition.
Tombs?
Tombs.
But I don't understand, sir. There have been other diggings.
This one went out there without Egyptian approval. Just let that mob out there get the idea for 1 minute we're digging up their ancient kings' graves, tampering with their religious beliefs, their superstitions, and the fanatics that started this riot would soon spread it into a national situation. All they want is a chance to throw us out and bury British rule. You leave for the Valley of the Kings before dawn tomorrow morning.
Yes, sir.
It's perfectly easy to imagine a film called Pharaoh's Curse beginning just like this. Introduction to protagonist, concise explanation of setting, their motivation, and their mission. Instead, Landau opts to begin by keeping his protagonist inconspicuous and off-screen, so that he can focus on establishing an oppressive mood through just the setting itself. There are many benefits to approaching the opening of your film in this way. The first and the most straightforward, as long as the various components of your opening do not become so complicated as to confuse the spectator, it is more cinematic to show rather than to tell, even if what you show is not necessarily directly related to what you tell. The visual interest provided by the exotic setting, and the desperation in the actors' performances, combined with the auditory stimulation of the ambient riot occurring off-screen, is immediately more impressive than the general simply telling Captain Storm what his mission is and why he has to do it. Bonus points, especially if you're making a horror film or thriller, if you eventually combine visual and auditory interest in an unsuspected way, such as a stone being hurled from off-screen and shattering the glass. By exploiting these techniques, Landau allows the director and producer the opportunity to engage the spectator on a visceral level, which can both enhance their basic attachment to the more formulaic aspects of the narrative, or, perhaps less charitably, help to distract them from what are rather thinly drawn stereotypes and a predictable story. Even if you could technically interpolate some, or even all of these elements into a more simplified opening, as in keeping the riot going on outside, but the general immediately invites Storm in to give him his mission, complete with the rock being thrown, you would sacrifice other benefits that only come from the opening a story indirectly through setting rather than directly through exposition. The most important of these is precisely the impression upon the spectator of the setting itself, apart from the narrative as something persistent and real, which in this case is imperative in order to create for the spectator some kind of consistent anxiety or dread. Because Storm is only introduced in any meaningful sense after the setting is already thoroughly established, and indeed because the specific scenario itself is only indirectly related to the role he is being called upon to perform, we can rest assured that whatever terrors it holds will continue to persist even when he is not present. For us as spectators, this also means that this tension will persist, just as with the riot outside the room, even when we are now totally following Storm's story and all of these particular elements are miles away and off-screen. The setting is made credible then, not just because of what is shown, but also because of what is not shown, replicating the conspicuous absences in information and gaps in our knowledge that prey upon our fears. Finally, even though the film's primary antagonists are not Egyptian nationalists, even though Storm's primary confrontations are with an American archaeologist and not with unruly natives, though the question of British rule is never addressed again, the mere dramatization of these components combined with the general's explicit connection of the ambush and burgeoning riot and Storm's mission, this creates a thematic continuity that persists throughout the film, even as it veers from the realm of the political, international, and racial tensions and into the realm of the melodramatic and supernatural. On an intuitive level, Landau is signaling to the hypothetical spectator that Pharaoh's curse is about more than just another vengeful mummy. And once again, the decision to introduce Storm only inconspicuously after some moments reinforces this angle. Though the plot of the film is literally about his mission, it is foremost, as in literally from the outset, more about its setting and context. Just as the general calls Storm in to fulfill a specific purpose in an implicitly broader, more variant project of imperial hegemony, i.e., maintaining British rule, he is called upon by the film to process one of many possible stories. Of these many possible stories, the one dramatized in Pharaoh's Curse, so ephemeral and abstract because of its supernatural content, is itself merely allegorical of what we see transpire ever so briefly in this opening scenario, divorced from the supernatural, grounded in at least the pretense of historical reality. A lot of that is theoretical, of course. I mean, I certainly found stuff to appreciate in it, but unfortunately, Roland Sholom's direction isn't up to the best of Landau's screenwriting. There's clearly a disconnect between what was written and what ultimately appeared on the screen. Sholom, true to his reputation, is narrowly focused on getting his audience from point A to point B as efficiently as possible. Through his very objective, which is to say frequently flat and affectless camera eye, the purpose of the film is to retread familiar horror film conventions and stir up lingering fascination with the land of Egypt as it has been well cultivated in the imaginary of Western Europeans. Highly imaginative and colorful depictions of Egypt and Europe are as old as Greek antiquity. The culturally rich kingdom features prominently in Greek mythology, and with the toppling of the Persians by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, it became not merely a valued trading hub of the vastly expanding Macedonian Empire, but also a venerated center of beauty and knowledge. This reputation continued well into the first millennia AD, when Roman hegemony replaced Greek, and then Byzantium usurped Western Rome. But depictions of Egypt and Europe changed abruptly after the conquest of the region by the Rashidun Caliphate between 639 and 646 AD. Now isolated from contemporary Egypt and Egyptians by stricter barriers of national identity, race, and, most importantly, religion, medieval Europeans could only look to the Old Testament and the Book of Revelations. Hence, the once revered kingdom became synonymous with heathenry, wanton carnality, and opulent despotism. Interactions between the Christian and the Muslim world became increasingly concerned with conquest and conversion rather than investigation, cultural exchange, and cooperation. These are obviously broad strokes, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm some expert on world history, but suffice it to say, the interest in and imagining of Egypt begins to change significantly in Europe during the Renaissance period. With growing scholarly and alchemical cultures invested in the recovery and translation of ancient Greek historical and philosophical works, the vast corpus of which was primarily preserved in the Islamic rather than the Christian world, Egypt became increasingly viewed by the educated and elites as a potential source of profound, even occult knowledge. During the Age of Enlightenment, fraternal societies, secret organizations, and occult spiritual movements alike turned not only to the purported, though frequently spurious texts of Egyptian antiquity, but also to their aesthetics as a means of signifying their own prestige and newly mythologized timelessness of their values. This craze even has its own name, Egyptomania. Imperial expansion into North Africa and the Arab world throughout this period and well into the 19th century only fed into this obsession with Egyptian antiquity as both an orientalized subject, a source to be appropriated for the sake of fashion and fetishistic interest to be duplicated as commodity, as well as a romantic point of reference in defining the identity of a rapidly modernizing European society, including with regards to reinforcing contemporary hierarchies of race. While Egypt is now generally viewed as having been a region of tremendous ethnic and cultural diversity throughout its history, it became conventional wisdom at this time that the Egyptian pharaohs and elites and ruling class themselves were in fact Aryan whites, thus confirming Egypt as the antecedent of contemporary European civilizations and reaffirming the natural superiority of white Europeans over darker-skinned races, who were presumed to only be in those regions as the underclass and slaves. Americans, of course, were especially bold in their Egyptomania. Just check out the obelisk of the Washington Monument, or Edwin Blashfield's panoramic mural Evolution of Civilization, painted in 1895 and adorning the ceiling of the main reading room of the Library of Congress. In its pictographic depiction of the progress of civilizations, it begins with Egypt and ends with America. But far from being easily categorized to one side of a binary, the modern Western imagining of ancient Egypt is fraught with ambivalence and contradiction. To the extent that it represented the antecedent of modern white civilization, its perceived decline and falling into the hands of the dark-skinned other seemed to portend the inevitable entropy of modern white civilization as well. Romantic veneration of Egypt as a cradle of knowledge and beauty was further counterbalanced by a far darker sensibility, in which precisely those aspects of the culture and its aesthetic perception that made it so exotic and arousing also made it a source of degenerating threat. None other than Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, wrote The Jewel of the Seven Stars, published in 1903. In it, an archaeologist plots to revive the mummy of an Egyptian queen, only for its apparition to possess his own daughter, transforming her from a demure picture of Victorian femininity into a monstrous embodiment of the masculinized, independent, new woman emergent among European middle class at the time of the novel's writing. In the pursuit of the occult knowledge from the past, the novel seems to suggest the white male patriarch has only sowed the seeds of his own destruction through decadence. In the realm of cinema, several films followed suit in that particular exploitation and sometimes parody of Egyptomania. Georges Méliès created Cleopatra in 1899, released in the States as Robbing Cleopatra's Tomb. Now lost, all that is known about it is that it involves a man chopping up the mummy of Cleopatra and then magically manifesting a beautiful woman from a smoking brazier. This is not to be confused with Méliès's later, less scandalous submission to Egyptomania, 1903's The Monster. The New York-based Thanhouser Company produced The Mummy in 1911, also currently lost. No less comedic in tone, the one-reel drama seems rather overtly inspired by Edison Studios' adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In it, a young businessman is eager to impress his sweetheart's Egyptologist father, and so purchases a mummy at auction, only for a live electrical wire to accidentally reanimate the thing. Revealing a beautiful princess, it makes romantic advances upon him, and, once scorned, wraps him up like a mummy for the Egyptologist to dissect. A far more elaborate, serious, and gothic example of the genre came out of Germany in 1918, The Eyes of the Mummy Ma, directed by Ernst Lubitsch. Those seeking a straight antecedent of the Universal film will be sorely disappointed. Instead, the film follows a wealthy German painter's rescue of a young Egyptian girl named Ma from the control of an evil hypnotist named Radu. Making her his wife, the painter attempts to civilize Ma, only for her exotic dance to make her the star of the vaudeville stage, leading to her tragically falling back into the grasp of the sinister Radu. Notably, all of these examples, from Stoker to Lubitsch, center the European fascination with Egypt on women, rather neatly betraying the psychosexual preoccupations of Western whites with the other. Even though not a literal mummy, Ma is nonetheless an apparition of sorts, a perfect exotic figment to act as both the innocent for the invading white to righteously rescue from the claws of the savage Oriental men, as well as their carnal reward for doing so. But whether melancholy or comic, there is a clear ambivalence to this trend, arousal inseparable from fear. With the lilting, dancing paramour as his motivation, it is the white man's burden to tread upon the uncivilized world, to rescue the land and its people from their unproductive, intemperate, and devious ways. But merely in doing so, the heart of darkness threatens to taint the white man, in both body and spirit, to drag him down as he attempts to lift others up from the mire. There are certain barriers that must be persistently upheld, the most pressing of which remains the barrier of the flesh. In symbolic terms, Ma is not simply Radu's prop, but his prostitute. The resurrection of the flesh is revealed as a veiled representation of, in the terms of blasphemy, two bodies becoming one in an unholy union.
1,000 pardons. I am hard at bay.
I'm Helen Grosvenor.
I called to see Sir Joseph.
He's in the study.
A conference? If I might perhaps wait.
Yes. Of course.
Have we not met before, Miss Grosvenor?
No, I don't think so. I don't think one would forget meeting you out of the...
The most influential example of Egyptomania in popular culture remains, of course, Universal Pictures' The Mummy from 1932. Capitalizing upon Howard Carter's rediscovery of the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun in 1922, as well as tabloid allegations of an apocryphal curse bedeviling those who had entered the tomb ever since, producer Carl Laemmle Jr. commissioned Richard Schayer to fashion a treatment from any literary resource he could find. Although both Schayer's treatment and the final film demonstrate striking parallels to Arthur Conan Doyle's short story, The Ring of Thoth, the original idea was to set the film in San Francisco, and the story would concern the infamous occultist and Freemason Alessandro Cagliostro using alchemical magic to survive into the 20th century. Laemmle then turned the treatment over to John L. Balderston, who had not only made major contributions to the studio's two previous horror hits, Dracula and Frankenstein, but had also been a reporter for New York World News on the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. Balderston changed the setting from the US to Egypt, and made the film's villain an ancient Egyptian priest named Imhotep, who is accidentally resurrected when a young archaeologist translates a cursed scroll and reads it aloud. This really was the first modern mummy movie, the type upon which all future endeavors were based, including 4 belated follow-ups that otherwise bear no relationship to the plot of the original, an Abbott and Costello crossover, a British remake, and its own loose franchise produced by Hammer Studios from 1959 through 1971, and then right back to Universal for 2 21st century reimaginings, first as high fantasy adventures starring Brendan Fraser in 1999 and 2001, and then as a mock turtle comic book universe cash-in starring Tom Cruise in 2017.
Welcome to Prodigium, Mr. Morton. Forgive the state of things. We had very little time to prepare for our guest. It's not an exact science, this business.
And the business being?
Evil, Mr. Morton. Recognize, contain, examine, destroy. She is by far the most ancient we've ever encountered.
It's plain to see that we've come a long way since the gothic moods of the Depression, to say nothing of the more graphic violence and cheeky sexuality that typified Hammer and many imitators' variations on the Mummy movie. Indeed, I think it's safe to say that Egyptomania as a phenomenon is thoroughly and perhaps rightfully dead. But say what you will about the absurdity of Victorian fascinations and racism, there was at least some earnestness among archaeologists in researching and advancing our understanding of antiquity that was disseminated in popular culture through its fiction. If the 2017 reboot illustrates anything, it's that film producers' estimation of the interest of American audiences in ancient or contemporary Egypt, or really any other culture besides their own in the world, is so low that they can't even make a movie about a mummy for anything less than $350 million in production and publicity combined, or without it being so aesthetically generic that it's basically illegible even as a monster movie that couldn't take place literally anywhere else in the world. Besides just general apathetic ignorance about the richness of Egyptian history, I think it's also safe to say that we're well into the new Dark Ages as far as how the nations of European whites view the cultures and peoples of North Africa and the Middle East. Still, though, there are motifs and themes that have reverberated throughout the last century, particularly in the persistent identification of Egypt as a setting of occult knowledge that, in some sense, prophesies the latest end of century for white Western civilization, as well as the eroticization of the mummy, the resurrection of the flesh now no longer being quite so subtle an allusion to deviant sexuality that transgresses racial and gendered norms. I mean, heck, just check out the scene in which Sofia Boutella as the mummy turns the formulaic tables on Tom Cruise, lasciviously caressing his prone body before attempting to penetrate him with a sacrificial dagger.
What?
And I wear him.
I'm sorry. What?
Me Satash. Me Panache.
Okay.
And Nashanenu.
No.
Empire evil.
One could argue even that in the latest Universal film's incarnation of the mummy as an evil princess, it harkens back directly to Stoker's own Jewel of the Seven Stars, speaking directly to anxieties about the new woman of a new generation. But we don't even need to go back that far. I mean, heck, what is that scene we just listened to except a variation of the same paradigm, albeit presented in a less overtly farcical manner than what we saw as far back as the Thanhouser Company's 1911 film? The same case could be made for the 1932 Universal film. While significantly different than previous examples of films exploiting Egyptomania in both aesthetic and narrative terms, it nonetheless follows from consistent themes and motifs established in preceding works. To a large extent, The Mummy directly repurposes content that had worked for Universal in their previous horror films. Just as with Frankenstein, we once again have a story dealing with the resurrection of a body, and none other than the Frankenstein's monster himself, Boris Karloff, takes on the role of the High Priest Imhotep. Also assuming a role very similar to the one they portrayed in a previous Universal film is Edward Van Sloan, who played Professor Van Helsing in Dracula and now plays Dr. Muller in The Mummy, another educated man who is at first dismissed for his faith in the supernatural, but becomes the key figure in destroying the undead monster. What's more, The Mummy is a blatant retread of Dracula, both narratively and thematically. Just as Bela Lugosi's foreign count pursued Mina, much to the distress of her English fiancé, so too does Imhotep pursue the young Helen, played by Zita Jahan, determined to kill and resurrect her as his undead bride. Even beyond the internal patterns of Universal's growing house of horrors, however, The Mummy also clearly repeats already well-worn themes of Egyptomania. One could well argue that the parallels between the studio's Dracula and Mummy are inevitable, given that the veiled obsession with the sexuality of the other as a rapacious, degenerating threat to whiteness is so prominent in both Stoker's representation of the Eastern European Count, as well as depictions of Orientalized peoples stretching back well into the Dark Ages. The qualifying factor in this reading is that, of course, it was virtually common sense among Western Europeans that the ancient Egyptians themselves were whites. Helen is, in fact, half German and half Egyptian, and the unwitting reincarnation of Imhotep's forbidden love, the ancient Egyptian princess Ankh-Sunamun. She is, in effect, the divine incarnation of Aryan past and present, the beauty of the superior white race personified. As in past variations, however, there's a Gothic duality to this affirmation of the natural lineage of civilizations, from ancient Egypt to modern Europe. More like Frankenstein's monster than Count Dracula, Karloff's Imhotep is presented as a semi-tragic figure, one who is motivated not by mere carnal desire for Princess Ankh-Sunamun, but by love transcending thousands of years of torment. But he is, nonetheless, the villain who stands in the way of the consummation between the living Helen and the colonial explorer, Frank Wemple, played by David Manners. Despite the fact, in scare quotes, that the ancient Egyptians were Aryan whites, they are the antecedents of modern civilizations who were nonetheless undone because they succumbed to darkness, both figurative and literal. This Egyptian part of the damsel Helen comes to represent her susceptibility in being seduced by the decadence of the flesh. It is her dark side, just as Imhotep, mummified alive for breaking taboos, represents the irrevocable darkness of the white man's origins, which is inseparable from the very races that he convinces himself are inferior animals. Imhotep, to disguise his dark, dead flesh, literally wears white makeup, a living dead betrayal of the reality that all whiteness is, fundamentally, only a negation of what is not white, which is always inherent, which has always been, and will always return when the new empire falls. Out of this love triangle, we thus get a dark triad of the white colonial imaginary: the white man, the liminal woman who exists between the world of light and darkness, and the dark masculine other. Through all of its more overt inspirations, we see a direct lineage between The Mummy and Lubitsch's The Eyes of the Mummy Ma. I would argue that it is probable that there was also some direct influence here, given that the director of The Mummy, Karl Freund, was in fact a German cinematographer active during the period in which The Eyes of the Mummy Ma was made, in which German cinema, particularly of the fantastic kind, was hailed internationally as the most innovative in the world. German Expressionism, either through inspiration or the actual importation of German filmmakers, was a direct influence upon American Gothic horror. In The Eyes of the Mummy Ma, we also see the white man, the pillar of civilization played by Harry Leek, the liminal damsel who represents the Platonic ideal of beauty, the essential link between the ancient and the modern world played by Paula Negri, and the dark other in Rabu, played by German actor Emil Jannings in Brownface. Filtered through the logic of contemporary white supremacy, Rabu, as an Arab character, is not, in fact, a true Egyptian. He represents the Arab invader who displaced the canonical Aryan originators of civilization 1,000 years ago. He is introduced to us as a literal con artist and, symbolically, an imposter and hostage taker. He holds Negri prisoner, where she must await rescue by the white man, the true heir to the legacy of civilization. But as with Karloff's later Imhotep, who himself plays the role of a Svengali, exerting hypnotic power over Zeta Jahan, Rabu also really is a magical figure, one who totally embodies all of the occult knowledge and power which is associated within the European imaginary with the mythologized Egypt of antiquity. The power is real because he is connected to the land, and his power over Ma is only real because she, in turn, really is of his land, his blood, his flesh. The same can be said for the relationship between Imhotep and Helen. The power only works because this dark magic, deeply connected to the land and its people, is tangible and real. It defines and links them. Neither Ma nor Helen can, thus, ever be fully a part of the civilized illusion that white Europeans have made for themselves, or, at least, not without whiteness itself being tainted. There are, therefore, only two solutions. In Lubitsch's film, Ma and Rabu die together, and the painter is left to look on with melancholy, the illusion shattered, adrift and alienated amid modernity, and all of its conspicuous absences due to its being defined only in negation of that which it is not. The other solution, presented in the Universal film, is the classical Hollywood one, a feat of pure wish fulfillment. The key here is that when Imhotep broke the taboos of his time, he effectively excommunicated himself from the legacy of civilization. Thus, when the white heroes turn the tide and destroy him, they effectively reassert themselves as the natural inheritors to this same legacy, as well as, of course, to Helen's body as a representation of it.
Helen! Call her. He has dragged her back to ancient Egypt. Call her. Her love for you may bridge the centuries.
Helen. Helen. Come back. It's Frank. Come back.
Jesus, I really lost the thread somewhere, didn't I? Look, what I'm trying to say is that there is a long and storied history of tropes that's embedded in the modern mummy film. So, something like Pharaoh's Curse, for as far from perfect, or even far from particularly good at all as it is, it presents us with an interesting footnote in the progression of those tropes. Now, remember what Tom Weaver said about Bel-Air Productions, how their horror movies are effectively a frequently unacknowledged bridge between gothic horror like The Mummy and the more graphic revival of the genre in the mid to late 50s. Well, the quaint little thing about the Mummy movie is that, unlike dark Eastern European castles or foggy moors, the aesthetics of Egyptomania are so much more specific because of their remoteness from contemporary Western spectators that they lend themselves much more overtly to an examination of not just how graphic content, but how overall themes and values change with each manifestation of a particular fad or cycle. Pharaoh's Curse appropriates numerous tropes from the modern Mummy movie as Universal Studios first formalized it, as well as from the longer tradition of Egyptomania. But it also revises the terms of these tropes significantly, and to an extent that it almost categorically rejects a particular way of understanding the other and the place of white Europeans historically and in the contemporary world. We can even think of it in terms of Pharaoh's Curse sharing the same cinematic space as Bel-Air's more profligate westerns. If we must define the genre of horror that began to emerge in the late 50s and exploded during the 60s in a trend that does seem to parallel the trajectory of the Western in remarkable ways, right down to the eventual explosion in popularity of foreign-made variations on the genre, then perhaps we could pick no better term than the revisionist horror film. Captain Storm sets out for the Valley of the Kings to halt the unapproved excavation of a long-lost tomb being conducted by American archaeologist Robert Quinton, played by George N. Neese. In tow are his officer and colonel, the military's resources stretched thin by growing revolt, as well as Quinton's wife Sylvia, played by Diane Brewster. As you might expect, not all is smooth sailing in the old Quinton marriage, and a flirtatious romance blooms between the captain and his guest.
Are you happy?
Why do you ask?
Oh, I don't know. For some reason, I just don't picture you in this wild, adventurous role.
Maybe I like it. Maybe I like the excitement, the adventure.
I think you're trying to talk yourself into it.
You fascinate me, Captain.
That's the nicest thing you've said the whole trip. I take back everything I thought about you.
Well, how would you like to look at yourself close up? Oh, I'm sure that you've been told you're charming, you're handsome, you have quite a way with the women. Any particular one you're running away from?
How about a truce? Let the mummies lie in their tombs, That's far enough.
This cozy moment is interrupted by the arrival of Samira, a mysterious Egyptian girl played by Ziva Radan. Traveling on foot, she is searching for her brother Numar, played by Alvaro Guillat, who is with Quinton's party. She offers to show them a shorter way to the Valley of the Kings, which immediately makes Storm suspicious. They are taking the long way because they know that they are less likely to encounter hostile locals. Regardless, he agrees to let Samira accompany them. Immediately, eerie goings-on befuddle the mission. A horse carrying their food rations disappears in the dead of night, their water husk is found empty, and a known watering hole is found bone dry.
So, I don't like it. I think the girl's fair gone crackers. She says we've been tailing off in the wrong direction for over 2 days now. She says that if we go on according to the map, we're going to find ourselves...
Listen, you. Stop telling my men where we're going or how to get there. Anything you've got to say, you tell me.
Please, Captain. If you do not go my way, it will be too late.
Heedless, Storm continues to follow the map. That very evening, a scorpion bites Sylvia. Finding that the medical kit is also missing, Storm is forced to suck out the venom himself. This saves Sylvia from immediate death at least, but her condition is still desperate. Without rations of water, Storm cannot be certain that she will survive the long road back to civilization. But he is also not confident that he can find his way to Quentin's excavation site in time. Finally, he relents to Samira's invitation, taking the shorter path. Meanwhile, at the lost tomb of Rahateb, Quentin fails to heed the warning curse inscribed on the sarcophagus of the Pharaoh's high priest. He has it opened and is about to cut the bandaging on the mummy's face when Numar faints from shock. It is then that Storm arrives, with his orders to have the tomb shut up and the expedition rescinded as soon as Numar and Sylvia are in good health. That's roughly the first 25 minutes of the picture, and Sholom's uninspiring direction notwithstanding, I still think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on just on a straightforward narrative level, before even digging into psychology. Landau does a remarkably good job of sustaining a sense of subtle unpredictability. Or maybe it's just the residual goodwill of that great opening, but even that is nothing to write off. By making the setting feel tangible, Landau now has the ability to make the characters feel grounded and believable, even as they are broadly drawn from stock types. This is critical because, as it turns out, Landau actually is far more interested in character than he is in the rudimentary elements of a monster movie. In the opening of the film, he established a sense of the unpredictable through a deliberate exploitation of the unknown, off-screen space, and the veiling of exposition in aspects of the setting, particularly colonial politics, that aren't directly related to the story. Over the following 20 minutes or so, he's actually able to sustain this eerie atmosphere remarkably well, and he does so, again, by veiling what is about to happen, a still off-screen excavation beginning the vengeful rampage of a mummy, in external materials that aren't in and of themselves directly related to these events. Obviously, all of the characters, both Storm and his party, as well as Samira, are trying to get to the same critical point, which is also what the spectator is ostensibly waiting for. Again, there's really no particular reason why it needs to take so long to get to Quentin's camp, but taking this time allows Landau the ability to subtly flesh out the characters, their relationships to one another, and thus the themes that ultimately give dimension to the superficial content of the film's second half. There is, obviously, the relationship between Storm and Sylvia that is building, but what is more important is the antagonism between Storm and Samira, or, so to speak, the antagonism as Storm perceives it. After all, Samira is the first Egyptian character we actually see on screen, and she emerges from the darkness, the negative space that once contained the unruly mob. She is aligned, through the perspective of Storm and his party, with the deceptive and the untrustworthy. As far as Storm is concerned, her invitation to lead the party on a shorter path to their destination, to stop the excavation of the tomb, might as well be a trap to lead them into the maw of this very off-screen, horrific other. Such suspicions seem to be substantiated, given that immediately after Samira arrives, their party is beset by numerous problems, including the threat of certain death. Indeed, after arriving at the dry watering hole, Storm refuses a second time to follow her directions, and a well-timed close-up of Samira touching the amulet around her neck seems to signify quite explicitly that she is invoking occult powers. That evening, the scorpion appears. The following morning, Storm is ready to relent to Samira's demands. But the arc of what Landau is dramatizing in this first of two acts to the film actually serves to subtly undermine this perception of events. Even if we accept that Samira is personally, supernaturally responsible for all the team's hardships, the critical point is that what she desires to accomplish remains fundamentally the same as Storm. She may be untrustworthy in that she literally has something to hide, but that is not the same as her being malevolent. That interpretation would only work if her interest were in stopping the party from reaching their destination in time. But clearly, the whole point is that she just wants to grind Storm's gears enough so that he finally takes the straightest path to get to Quentin's camp, to get there sooner rather than later. In other words, there shouldn't be any antagonism between these figures, but the events of the film's first act are structured in such a way that there appears to be antagonism. Invariably, there will be those who will call this a plot hole and chalk it up to bad writing. I would personally reject that claim. It is clear from the moment of Samira's introduction that she is interested in more than simply finding her brother. She wants to get to him before it is too late. She doesn't explain what that means, but we sure as hell know what that means. When they finally arrive at Quentin's camp, only after Storm finally relents for Sylvia's sake, she pretends that they are, after all, too late, and we sure as hell know what that means. Thus, given that we all sure as hell know what too late means, and that it is clear that Samira is just trying to get to her brother before it is too late, what is preventing us from concluding that she has actually done everything right, and that the story of this act is that Storm has gone about things entirely wrong? It is, after all, also his mission to get to the tomb before it is too late, before Quentin can spark a huge national scandal and potential revolution. But following the orders of his superiors, he takes the most roundabout way possible, despite all of Samira's protestations, and gets there too late. Clearly, the problem is not anything that Samira is actively doing. The problem is that Storm took precisely the course of action that led them to being too late. Samira offered a straightforward path to getting both parties what they mutually wanted, and Storm rejected this offering, which is what actually resulted in the release of the dark occult power, not anything that Samira actively conjured. It only appears to be so because that's how Storm perceives it. This is neither a plot hole nor a function of lazy writing, though a so bad it's good perspective on filmmaking might certainly lead some viewers to believe it is so. The issue is that Pharaoh's Curse is virtually illegible on a narrative level in a way that other B-horror and sci-fi films are not, only in contrast. This is because, for the most part, it is a rare B-horror film that strategically avoids unnecessary exposition, and even eludes it in order to specifically focus our attention on setting and character rather than superficial content. The story that is being told is defined fundamentally by motivations, desires, and prejudices that are, if not unstated, at least not belabored. To wit, we must remember Storm's actions in terms of his motivations, not simply what he is told to do. He is told that it is his job to stop the excavation of a taboo Egyptian site. His given motivation for doing so is to maintain British control of Egypt as a vassal state of the empire. When Samira emerges from the shadows, again aligned with the off-screen space of the unruly Egyptian mob, it is through his eyes inherently suspicious. Despite the fact that they ostensibly have a mutual interest in seeing that the tomb is not violated, Storm perceives antagonism because he views the other as inherently antagonistic. The story of this first act of the film is not about Samira as the horrific other using her occult power sabotaging the righteous white people. It is about how Storm's programmatic racism, quite literally a function of what he has been ordered to do and how he has been ordered to carry it out, quite literally manifests the violence that will dominate the second act of the film, which would be, of course, a metaphoric representation of what he was specifically supposed to prevent from happening on a national scale. Now, I want to be clear here that I am not saying Pharaoh's Curse is an anti-racist film. I said it with the Mole People, and I'll say it here. To a significant extent, movies of this period made by white filmmakers were programmatically racist. There is no point in being pedantic about just how racist each individual work is, because that's not how racism works. Racism is ideological. It is not something you buy into in certain amounts and can then produce receipts to show just how much or little you bought. And when considered in the context of historical Egyptomania, Pharaoh's Curse clearly still alludes to white supremacist conceptions of the world and the role of whites within it. That will make more sense when we come to the ending, but for now, let's just say this. The significance of identifying Pharaoh's Curse as a revisionist horror movie, much how we might define a revisionist western, is not in overrating the extent to which it rejects certain tropes of the genre, such that it constitutes a total rejection of attendant values and ideology. The significance is in using films in order to trace overt revisions in how dominant ideology negotiates inevitably changing norms. For Pharaoh's Curse, what are being revised are effectively two essential narratives of Egyptomania. The first is of the mythology that establishes a natural continuity between Egyptian civilization and contemporary white supremacy as it extends itself through colonialism and imperialism. The second is the presumption of white man's burden, part tragedy, part victory, but always a heroic narrative, in which it is the responsibility and uniquely righteous role of European whites to civilize the non-white other. We have already seen at this point in the film a significant revision in the first narrative. What we see in the very opening scene of the traumatized soldiers is far from the type of heroism one might associate with the white man who suffers merely for doing what's right, for trying to educate, civilize, and elevate the other. Rather, what we see is much closer to even war films in the aftermath of Vietnam and onwards, and with increased vigor in the depictions of Arabs in post-9/11 war films. Horrific representations still abound of the non-white other as a swarthy, untrustworthy, and violent mob, defined as much by their physical representation as they are by their alignment with the darkness of the off-screen space. But when the camera then focuses on the soldiers, the enlisted men, what are depicted are not heroes, but figures who are fundamentally broken, physically beaten, and psychologically crippled by their experiences. The casualties of violence that they have suffered, ostensibly in the interest of their country and for the good of the people in the lands they have invaded, but where the actual justification for that invasion and their own conscription into service feels totally remote and incomprehensible from what is actually happening on the ground. The soldiers have not returned to the cradle of civilization to find their proud ancestry, but rather a yawning maw of, as the speaking character puts it, literally medieval violence. The artifacts of that ancient civilization are now thoroughly defined by the horrific other that are now its stewards, the hosts who are violently rejecting the white projection like a pathogen. The second narrative is the one that will end up being the most thoroughly revised, and to an extent even outright rejected, portending shifts in the dominant ideology of European white nations away from the mythology of white man's burden and towards a kind of cynical isolationism. But again, all in due time. When we last left our cast, they had failed to arrive in time to stop Quentin's opening of the High Priest's sarcophagus, and are now marooned at the excavation camp until such time as the two sick members of its party, Sylvia and Numar, have sufficiently recovered. Obviously, knowing that the characters were too late, we know the one obvious way in which even more horrors will be foisted upon our heroes. But what's interesting here is that it is from both sick parties, his white wife and his Arab servant, that Quentin will find himself facing a kind of rebellion. That evening, recovered enough from the effects of the scorpion venom, Sylvia reveals her actual reasons for visiting him. She wants a divorce.
And what were you before I married you? Some starry-eyed, mousy little librarian in a museum. What did you know then? Books and catalogs and files. And who took you away from all that? Took you to all the places and showed you the things that you'd read about and then cataloged and filed away.
You did. But you didn't do it for me. You did it for yourself. You tried to make me into something that you wanted me to be. Something for your own ego and satisfaction. Something to show off to anyone who would look and admire so you could say, see what I've done. See what I've made. You never cared about me or my feelings or what I wanted to be.
What's this? What do I hear? Why, if I'm not mistaken, that sounds distinctly like the crowing of the Victorian patriarch's worst fear, the new woman. Now, in case you're wondering, no, there will not be any dalliance between Sylvia and a decrepit mummy, but the equivocation between the uncovering of occult knowledge and the threatening transgression of gender and sexual norms is still remarkable in its salience from 55 years after Jewel of the Seven Stars was first published. Just as remarkable is the implicit parallel that is created between Sylvia and Numar, who, even as we speak, is undergoing a metamorphosis, from a dutiful servant to the vengeful reincarnation of the High Priest. Resurrection, possession, rebellion, all of these are foundational tropes of the Mummy movie. But in Landau's specific adaptation of them, what comes through is not merely sympathy, even Karloff's Imhotep was a tragic figure, but an unmistakable recognition of his oppressed characters as oppressed characters. In exchange for natural continuity between Egyptian antiquity and modern white Europeans, what we get is a spectrum of the other, three faces representing those who are marginalized, repressed, or oppressed by this mythology. There is Sylvia, the bourgeois white woman who is just as much an object to her husband as an artifact. There is Numar, the servant whose compulsory silence, long before his explicit metamorphosis, is already a kind of living death. And then there is, finally, Samira, as the symbolic bridge between these two types of oppression, specifying its common source. As I alluded to, Numar becomes possessed by the spirit of Rahateb's high priest, his body masticating into a mummified husk as it hides itself throughout the secret passages of the tomb, killing whoever it manages to corner there. In another interesting twist on conventions established in the Universal film, however, the curse will not necessarily persist indefinitely until all who entered the tomb are dead. Samira makes that quite clear.
Try to warn, try to help. You would not listen. Now, unless you leave us alone, it will be too late for all of you.
Remarkably, the team actually decides to follow through with Quentin's plan to keep exploring the tomb in order to find some secret to how to put down the mummy.
I say we find the royal tomb and we find the answer.
I'm going to surprise you, Quentin. I say we do too.
Once again, Captain Storm chooses the most roundabout path to reach an inevitable conclusion. From there, Pharaoh's Curse continues to be one of the most bizarrely plotted supernatural films I've ever encountered, mummy movie or otherwise. To clarify, it's not just that Numar becomes possessed by the High Priest's spirit, it's also that the mummy of the High Priest has literally disappeared. Discovering this, Quentin and Storm also discover a trail of tracks seemingly belonging to a cat. At the climax of the film, while the surviving men are on the verge of discovering the Pharaoh's chamber, Sylvia is sleeping in her tent, but is disturbed by skittering sounds outside. Waking up, she watches as the shadow of what looks like a winged cat passes across the tarp, only for Samira to enter. Horrified, Sylvia runs out to tell the team. It becomes apparent to us as spectators that the shadow that we see is akin to a silhouette of the bust of Bastet, an Egyptian cat goddess who was seen as a defender of the sun god, Ra, and thus of the pharaohs. The team leaves the tomb to investigate, all except Quentin, who, determined to enter what he thinks is the pharaoh's chamber, is drawn by Numar into a trap and killed. When the rest of the team returns to the high priest's chamber, they discover the sarcophagus returned to its proper state. Opening the lid, they discover the mummy back in its place. Cutting the wrappings, they discover Numar's body inside.
Numar, the high priest? He came all the way across the desert with us to protect the secret of his king. And it did not fail.
Andrews, you know what you're saying?
After death, new life, in another form, another body. And the soul will go on to exist eternally. If you will let yourself believe there is such a thing as reincarnation.
Well, then, Samira, his sister, she knew. Then she must...
Bobasti, the cat goddess.
Of course, None of this explains, even if the priest was reincarnated in a new body, what happened to the original mummy body. But beneath all of these eccentricities, we noticed a direct parallel between the second act of the film and the first. Once again, the white explorers choose a totally roundabout way of trying to circumvent the hostility they have provoked by their incursion, and Samira, as a guide, using occult power, must compel them in the right direction before it is too late. Once again, she chooses Sylvia to achieve her objective, her revelation of her true occult nature reinforcing the unique enigmatic connection they have to one another. And once again, though more abundantly clear, the dark magic of the other proves to have little to do with why it is too late for Quentin. This disaster is of his own making, a consequence of his demand to lay claim to a history that is not his own. All stories about mummies are necessarily set against a backdrop of European imperialism, but none before Pharaoh's curse, and few after, are so explicit about it. This coercive relationship between the so-called civilized world and the other is the premier fixation of these horrors, coded as a primordial battle between good and evil. But unlike the universal film, there is no final triumphant reassertion of the power of white masculinity over the other, or the reclamation of his woman from this swarthy clutch. Quite the contrary, Samira as the transgressive feminine force, in her own way, possesses Sylvia, and successfully uses her to create an outcome that ends in the expulsion of the invader. Critically, however, this weaponization of the new woman is not portrayed as pernicious, just as Samira and Numar are never fully malevolent. Samira doesn't even allow them to be. The film revises not only the supremacy of the white narrative, but also the narrative of the other, as simply as Storm's superior would have it, a fanatical and superstitious bunch. It is rather calculated, rational, and ironically seems, in some ways, to demonstrate more value for the actual lives and dignity of the colonizer than he would ever show for the colonized. The external violence and rebellion against British rule that it stands for is not irrational or barbaric or indiscriminate. It is always a logical response and irreducible in its complexity, impossible to essentialize except that it is authentic in its claim to the land and history in a way that the colonizers' fantasies can never be. This is then finally reinforced by the revelation that Numar, the simple servant, was ipso facto literally a high priest, literally an ancient being who was just waiting for them. There is tremendous potential for this other to not merely be tragic, but fully heroic. Besides an anti-colonial framework, there is also a quasi-feminist potential. The rebellion that Quentin and Storm witness is not reducible to simply a foreign phenomenon. Sylvia is not just the unwitting tool of Samira, though she is the unwitting tool of Samira in part, but she is also a parallel figure in her own context. She is already rebelling against Quentin's impositions upon her. The rebellions are happening everywhere in the so-called civilized world, mirroring one another. Indeed, the spirit of one rebellion emboldens another. Whereas the new woman was feared in Stoker's day, it is now, to a certain extent, embraced in Pharaoh's curse. But don't get it twisted, this revision only suffices insofar as it forms the basis for another kind of white supremacist fantasy. With Quentin's death, Storm is successfully able to cover up the violation of the tomb, and thus procure for his superior officer the exact outcome that was desired for the colonizers. In truth, the representative of white colonial patriarchy has not died. Instead, it was just that some crank got himself killed. The agents of empire, on the other hand, have survived. And their reaction to these horrors, the traumatic revelation of occult knowledge through the eroticized flesh, particularly Ziva Rodin's, good lord, but their reactions are not to internalize any wisdom. They do, indeed, act in much the way that they would have had the mummy been destroyed, as the threat to civilization has merely been obfuscated onto Quentin as a convenient scapegoat. The problem, it would seem, is not even necessarily colonialism itself, but Quentin as an irresponsible and incompetent manager of those terms. Similarly, we could say that the problem is not so much the repression of women, but Quentin as not being a real man, as not being a effective manager of his wife's affairs. Just as with Storm and Sylvia's flirtatious conversations, dredging up uncomfortable facts is too traumatic for the European bourgeois psyche. The only solution is ignorance and isolationism. To, as Storm puts it, let the mummies lie in their tombs.
The cruelties of life, Faraday. I possess the most fabulous story, but only Quentin could have told it and been believed. Should I tell it? They would only point at their heads and say, poor fellow. A doctor he needs for his head.
So, just some closing thoughts. There is a fundamental disconnect in Pharaoh's Curse. Weaver is correct that the film acts as a bridge from a kind of classic Hollywood to a revisionist horror. But for Roland Sholem, that bridge is solely a matter of content. He directs the film as if it is one of Universal's many Mummy spin-offs. The tradition that Landau is clearly deriving from, in the emphasis on realistic setting as informing character, the importance of characters' subjectivity and how it shapes their perceptions of the world, what's real and isn't real, even transgressive themes regarding sexuality and gender buttressed by, well, quite literally a cat person. It's obvious that Landau, not unlike Pat Fielder with The Vampire, owes a significant inspiration to the works of Val Lewton. Eventually, we really are going to need to cover more of his films. It'll be interesting to see how much Val Lewton proved to be a formative influence on a kind of revisionist horror. Anyway, I know I usually tend to do 2 movies in one episode when I watch a double feature, but Pharaoh's Curse kind of surprised even me by how much it gave me to work with, so first of all, forgive me, and second of all, join me next week, and we'll get into the other film in this double feature package from Bel-Air Productions. Actually, it was the first film in the lineup, though it was shot second. Yes, join me next week for Voodoo Island.
Nobody ever goes to that island. Not in his right mind.
Why do you say that?
I don't say it. It's what the natives say. What they have been saying for the last 50 years.